Hi everybody, my name is Todd Presner. I am a faculty member and the chair actually of the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. We teach a number of languages, literatures, histories, including Yiddish in my department. I am also the former director of the Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and so I'm really happy to be back in this capacity to introduce our guest speaker today. This is part of the annual lectures in Yiddish Studies, sponsored by the Michael and Irene Ross Endowment. And I want to welcome you today, and I'll also introduce our guests, Professor Rebecca Margolis, in just a second. I do want to acknowledge that I want to acknowledge the Levy staff, in particular Raina, David, and Vivian and Chelsea, who are here, as well as the center director, Bill Schniederwind, who's right there. So we're very pleased that the center, of course, continues to be in such wonderful and good hands. One reminder is just your cell phones. If you have to take a call, please feel free to step outside. Silence them during the talk, please. And out of courtesy, of course, to our guests and other audience members. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our guests, Professor Rebecca Margolis, who is the Pratt Foundation Chair in Jewish Civilization at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Her research explores Yiddish cultural production across the past century, including and across different media forms, including literature, theater, film, and television. She's the author of a number of books, including Basic Yiddish, a grammar and workbook, Jewish Roots, Canadian Soil, Yiddish Culture in Montreal between 1905 and 1945, and most recently, two books, Yiddish Lives On, Strategies of Language Transmission, and the book that she'll be talking about today, The Yiddish Supernatural on Screen, Dybbuks, Demons, and a Haunted Jewish Past, of which obviously the title will come from there. I do just want to mention just briefly, the book is an exploration through primarily the genre of film of the transformation of the figure of the dybbuk, which you'll hear more about today, but this, many of you know, is a soul of the dead possessing the living. Comes out of the long history of Jewish and Yiddish folklore and makes various reappearances and transmutations in cinema, and particularly in the 1930s, and today in contemporary global media. So we'll actually be learning quite a bit about the genealogy and various remediations of this fascinating figure. So without further ado, I'm going to bring our speaker to the forefront. Thank you.
So I would just like to echo the thanks to everyone who brought me here, and for everybody who's in the room today. I'm really excited to be speaking to you about this topic that is a passion of mine, scholarly but also personal. I love what I write about relating to this topic. I'm what's called an ACA-fan, which means I'm an academic and a fan, and I'm not embarrassed to admit that. So what I've prepared for today, I don't have a formal speech because I wanted to sort of adapt my comments to who's in the room and what you're interested in. So I'm actually at points going to look around and ask you, would you like more of this? And if you say yes or no, I'll sort of gauge the feeling in the room and then move on. What I've prepared is tracing a particular trope around the dybbuk through a 1937 film that's become very iconic, all the way through to the present. And different manifestations of tropes relating to Jewish possession, particularly relating to the word dybbuk. So it's a term that's really become a monster alongside Dracula, Frankenstein. It's become a recognizable monster. And what does that mean and what has it done? But my own particular interest is the linguistic element, because one of the things that I've observed as more and more of these Jewish film and TV productions come out that invoke the dybbuk, they're also using Yiddish, which is, to me, very interesting. And they're using Yiddish in ways that are not necessarily accessible or user-friendly. They're not just throwing in Yiddish words that are cute and funny and make us giggle. They're using subtitled Yiddish, in some cases, to scare us a lot. So how has this new attitude towards Yiddish manifested in these dybbuk narratives? So that's kind of what I'm going to do for you today. I've got different clips. I've got some pretty scary clips in the middle, and then I've got some comedy stuff at the end. So I'll make sure that we get to the comedy so that you all sleep tonight. And I will warn you if there's something frightening, so I'm not just going to surprise you with scary things. So these are the key points that I'm going to be talking about. And just quickly, I'm going to give you sort of the theory on the front end and then do close reads of these various films and TV shows. And I want to say that the dybbuk narrative trajectory is one element of what I'm interested in. I'm also interested in horror movies that are not dybbuk films that use Yiddish, and there are a few of those. And then there's also another genre, which is the Yiddish prologue, where people will take mainstream cultural production, for example, an episode of Law and Order, and then they'll tack on a little bit of Yiddish at the front, or Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And why does that happen? And that's not necessarily dybbuk related, but that's also a thing that happens with Yiddish. And if you want to ask me about that, or look in the book, learn more about that, I welcome that. So for today, the theory piece is that Yiddish works in a particular functional way. And what's interesting with the filmmakers and TV creators who use Yiddish, not in a way that's necessarily inherently comical, but to connect Yiddish to identity, memory, vanished past, Holocaust, the immigrant experience. They're no longer intending Yiddish to be inherently funny, which is new. And they are not necessarily aware of each other. So this is something interesting that I found when I interviewed some of these creators. And I was lucky that a lot of them were interested in talking to me about their work. And all of them felt they were the first. Like Yiddish has never had there's never been a Jewish horror movie that uses Yiddish, or Yiddish has never had this kind of exposure. And then I kind of am embarrassed and I say, actually there are like these 13 other things. But there's this sense of being the first. And creators who do this kind of work that I'm going to show you, they never do it again. So there's no second follow-up. It's so much work to have this Yiddish multilingualism on screen. It's very labor intensive, and so we just get these one-offs. Usually we have a showrunner for a TV show, or we have an auteur, so a filmmaker who is the director and has also done the script and often even stars in the film. They're the ones who are interested in telling these very involved, intricate narratives where there's a dybbuk and they need to have Yiddish. That plays an important role. So this brings us to number 2. So Yiddish isn't just schmuck and putz. Yiddish has full semantic meaning. People are uttering sentences, or they're having dialogues, and it always means something. It's never just that, wouldn't it be cool to just have some Yiddish? You actually have to think about why it's there, again, because it is so labor intensive. So we have these various functions, and I'll actually invite you to think about those functions with me. I don't have the answers to all of the questions that I ask surrounding this phenomenon. So there are various functions that include authenticity. I have a list here. Authenticity, texture, nuance, narrative character development, or a signifier. So Yiddish has meaning. It means something when people use it on screen. Again, just to point out what may be obvious or not, there is no natural audience for Yiddish cinema outside of the Hasidic world, and Hasidim aren't going to watch any of the things that I'm showing you today. This is not by them or for them. They have their own cinematic work, which is really interesting and has its own parameters and tropes, but it is not the things that I'm showing you today. So who is the Yiddish-speaking audience? It doesn't exist. It's imagined. It's an imagined world where there's a film with imagined functions for Yiddish, and there's an imagined audience of people who aren't relying on the subtitles. But that's a fiction. Which brings us to number 4, which I've termed the transvernacular process, where we have a way of bringing Yiddish to life. It's not a revival, it's not revitalization, it's not revernacularization of Yiddish. Yiddish has been continually spoken, so it's not a language that's being revived from death, although a lot of people have the idea that Yiddish is dead or dying. But what's happening here is we have this self-contained fictive world, an imagined space where people speak Yiddish. And the people making the film or TV show aren't Yiddish speakers, generally speaking. They need translators, or they do some really interesting translation where they call on people they know people's mother-in-laws who happen to speak some Yiddish, and that's where the Yiddish gets generated, or they bring in an expert, consultant. In all of the cases where we have this Yiddish that I'm going to show you today, we have actors who have to memorize the Yiddish. Very often they've never spoken Yiddish before, they've never really heard it. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it's a little bit more belabored. And the expectation is that audiences also don't know Yiddish. So we have this interesting, what's called pseudo-subtitles. There's a scholar named Carol O'Sullivan who's written about film translation, and she gives examples of many languages where this happens. So for example, indigenous languages, or invented languages like Klingon, right? Where there's no Klingon speaking audience. The filmmakers aren't Klingon speakers. The actors have to memorize the Klingon, but it is such a big deal that they get it exactly right. And Yiddish kind of sits there in terms of what happens. So just quickly, the dybbuk genre, because it is a genre. So as Todd mentioned, we have a soul of the dead that clings to the living. That's what a dybbuk is. There's a ton of literature, so much material about this phenomenon before we get to the sort of famous, recognizable dybbuk that we find in this 1937 film, which I'll show you a clip of in a minute. We have this salvage ethnography project that happens in the early 20th century, where Shin Ansky, who went through all kinds of permutations in his own life as a Jewish intellectual, decided that he needed to collect all of this vanishing folklore, all of the folkways of people, including all of their demonology. And he was so fascinated, so the story goes, that he wrote a play called Der Dybbuk zwischen zwei Welten, which means the Dybbuk between two worlds. And that's a really important piece, is that you're between the world of the living and the dead, and it's kind of a fluid barrier. It's not an absolute, there's no wall between the living and the dead and these two worlds. So that film, 1937 film, was re-released in 1989, and you can see there was a whole rhetoric around re-releasing this film because it was one of the first Yiddish language films that was reassembled, given subtitles, and then released in the film festival circuit. And people looked at this in 1989 and said, okay, well, this is the Holocaust risen from the ashes. We've got this phenomenon that Andre Bernstein calls backshadowing, where we look at the Dybbuk in 1937 and we say they are all going to die in the Holocaust. That whole world is going to vanish. And we can't help looking at the film as a memorial. And this has a big impact on people who do Dybbuk-related projects beyond, because everyone sees this 1937 film. It's kind of the main text, the iconic text that everyone looks at. Another important theoretical concept is the idea that you have these spectral resonances that remain with us. So that's often called hauntology, and that's Jacques Derrida sort of came up with this idea, and then it gets very widely disseminated. In the Jewish context, we have the rupture of migration, we have the rupture of the Holocaust, we have the rupture of Jewish identity, shifting Jewish identity, vanished Jews. And so the idea of having this specter, this possession, this dybbuk is actually a logical way of telling stories about rupture, which is something that we'll see examples of in a minute. Number 6, genres. So the dybbuk appears across genres. So we'll see examples of each. And then number 7, important for our purposes, is this concept of folklore. So this is something that Jeffrey Chandler talks about in an article that he wrote about A Serious Man, where he says, this is actually not a dybbuk narrative according to the rules of what a dybbuk is. And I'll show you a little clip of it and you'll see what that means. We're in a space where filmmakers and television creators are using the term dybbuk as a generic monster of some kind of a possessing spectral force, but they're not adhering to the rules. And that's folklore. And we see that in Jewish horror generally, where people, for example, there's a filmmaker who takes a monster or a demonic figure called the mazik, which if you grew up in a Yiddish-speaking space and you were called a mazik, means you're kind of like a little rascal. It might be used affectionately. But the mazik in this film is this monster, this terrifying, possessing monster. So we have filmmakers and television producers who are taking the term dybbuk or taking monsters from Jewish tradition that appear in the Talmud, in mystical texts, in folklore, and they're just creating their own stories. And one of the interesting questions is, why are they doing that? Why aren't they following the rules of how these monsters are supposed to behave? Why are they inventing their own? It's an open question. I'm really interested to see or to hear what you think of that question. So the first little clip I'm going to show you is from the 1937 Dybbuk, and this is Michał Waszyński from Poland. So there were two Dybbuk-themed films made in the same year, released in the same year. There's this one, and there's another one called Kiaskaf, which means the handshake. This is the one that really got traction. It's an expressionist film. It was incredibly technologically complex for its time. So if you can imagine 1937, cameras are these huge, heavy things. It's a big deal to even have sound. And this film was very experimental. There were a lot of special effects that to us don't look like much, but at the time were huge. The other thing about this film is it's very long and kind of cumbersome, and that's because when the film was re-released in 1989, there was a collection of every scrap of film relating to dybbuk, and nobody knew what the film was actually supposed to look like. So in that Jewish tradition of fence building, sort of maintaining fences, so you always do this sort of stricter thing, they took all the reels and just strung them together. So there are, if you're watching dybbuk and you're like, oh my God, this is dragging, it's because they're putting all the cuts together and not including the edited process. The actual film was about an hour and a half. There's a new version by Lobster Films, which is an hour and a half, where they took more liberty in splicing and editing it together. So that's just, if you're gonna watch the dybbuk and you haven't seen it, it's just an interesting thing to be aware of. So I'm just gonna show you a little bit of this because it is absolutely iconic in terms of establishing the aesthetics and narrative and the tropes around the dybbuk. So just a bit of background. So our narrative here, this is the character of Leah. We have a film where there are two lovers who are bound together by a vow that their fathers make before they're born. One of the fathers dies at sea and the vow is never brought to fruition, and they fall in love anyway. He dies tragically, and this is the day of her wedding to another man. So here we're going to meet the dybbuk.
Kale, as men lost a kalalein arda sitte, imen beiser hiches und Jahwe.
Something very, very sad. Is the name Shumes to the Menschen, who their wichtig und Jürgen gewohnt Vater der Zeit, und Beis.
Nicht steu Beis. Ne Shumes und Verstorbene kämen sich ihm auf der Welt, wandern die Seeder greifen seine Ausleitung. Sind die keine Shumes, der mit Gildul in Chayes, Tisch und Zemuchen. Und am Mund trefft, als vergugelte Schumme, bringt allein nach fremden, lebendigen Gift, aus die Amuli gewählt. Du siehst da Dybbuk.
Dybbuk?
So that is our pivotal moment in this film. That is where the dybbuk enters her, and she's going to be speaking in a man's voice who is her beloved Chonin. People have called this film Romeo and Juliet, sort of a tragic Yiddish accented Romeo and Juliet, because it's the two lovers who can never be together. I'm not going to give away any of what happens at the end. If you haven't seen this film, it's one of these classic films. But I want you to note the visual sort of iconography, the way that the dybbuk is explained. We have Liliana playing Leia, and she was quite a well-known Yiddish actress who made a marvelous transition to film. If you watch classic Yiddish films, you'll see her in several films. But this is this iconic film that, generally speaking, people who go and make a Yiddish accented dybbuk horror movie or TV episode, they've watched this. If anything, this is what they've seen. There are also, I want to add, dozens of dybbuk films that I don't talk about because they don't have Yiddish in them. My orientation is really this phenomenon in the last 15 years where filmmakers and TV producers have started using full spoken Yiddish to give us these narratives. So Serious Man, can I just see how many people have seen A Serious Man? Okay.
Where do you watch these programs?
Pardon me?
Where do you see these programs, the Jewish films?
The dybbuk you can actually see on YouTube. Yeah, it's the long version. You can also buy Lobster Films. They have a Blu-ray set of 10 beautifully remastered Yiddish films for $25. So if you're at all interested in Yiddish cinema, it's nice to just have that box set with new subtitles. So this is A Serious Man, which is important for us because this is a moment where a moment where for the first time we have mainstream cinema in the United States with just people going to see a movie that just starts with Yiddish. So the prologue functions like in Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare's works and other works. The convention of a prologue is that it sets the imagined space. So we as viewers, we're sitting in a darkened theater. The titles haven't started yet. This is called a cold open, and it just starts. So this is our imagined space. However, after this imagined space is created, we transition into 1960s Midwestern America. And the connection between this prologue and the rest of the film is never explained. Scholars argue about it endlessly. The Coen brothers, when they were asked about it, they said, we don't know, the way, people do when they're artists. They probably had some idea. But there was a journalist that went to them and said, we found this really creepy. The prologue is creepy. And they said, good. We're glad it's creepy. So there's been an endless amount of debate around how this prologue fits with the rest of the film. I encourage you to watch A Serious Man and then send me an email, tell me what you think. Because it's never gonna be resolved because it's a question that sits within the film. I'm not gonna play you the whole thing. I'm gonna play you the last roughly 2 minutes. We have this very interesting situation here where, like the 1937 dybbuk, we've got Yiddish speakers from the Yiddish theater world who create the Yiddish that we hear, which is unusual. Generally speaking, when Yiddish is put on screen, even in things like if you've seen Unorthodox on Netflix, there's a consultant that comes in who translates an English script into Yiddish, and then the actors work really hard to phonetically memorize the Yiddish, and they get some of it right and some of it is not great. And then if you're lucky, you get somebody who used to be a Hasidic who comes in and then plays a part as well. So we have this mix of methods. This one, we have Alan Lewis Rickman and Yelena Shmulenson, who are both theater people from New York. They both auditioned for the part because it's Ethan and Joel Coen. He's doing there's a Yiddish thing in his film. All of the Yiddish actors, they all flocked to the audition. The translation of the scene was terrible. And so Alan Lewis Rickman said, look, if you give me the part, I'll rewrite it for you. And so he is the person who created the Yiddish dialogue that you hear. It's quite idiomatic. It sounds like Yiddish. You can use it for teaching purposes if you're a Yiddish teacher, and it's not problematic. And it also stars Feivush Finkel, who is a Yiddish actor who was basically raised in the Yiddish theater and then went and did some things in the secular, non-Yiddish speaking space He did Picket Fences, if you're familiar with that show. So he stars as Dybbuk, question mark, because that's how he's listed in the credits. So this is the Coen brothers using the dybbuk, but it's not really a dybbuk. So I'm just going to show you the end, and it's very mysterious and marvelous. And the big question is, why did this scene have to be in Yiddish? What does it do to the scene to have it in Yiddish? And again, the audience has not been warned in any way about what's happening. They don't even know what language this is. So people seeing this film the first week it came out are like, what language am I hearing? I don't even know what this is. All right, here we go. And then from this, we transition into 1960s Midwestern America and this American-born teenager in Hebrew school. And then there's a narrative that unfolds about a man named Larry Gopnik, where everything goes wrong for him. And the question of how this prologue fits with the rest of the film is completely up to you to debate and discuss and decide. There is no answer to this. What I want to draw your attention to is that this is an 8-minute mini film entirely in Yiddish with subtitles. That happens before the opening credits. It's not explained, it's not situated, and the Yiddish, I think, adds to the sense that we are very much in an imagined past. We are foreigners. And this is something that happens through deliberately subtitled multilingual cinema and television, is that when we hear whatever language it is usually accompanied by subtitles, we are the foreigners, we are the outsiders, we are aliens to this linguistic world. And that is significant. And this is particularly for lesser spoken or lesser known languages, or languages that the audience is not expected to know. And Yiddish falls into that category in a release of an American film, where there might be a handful of people who know some Yiddish, but not necessarily a lot of people who can manage Yiddish for an 8-minute, quite complex, idiomatic scene. So we have this genre of dybbuk horror films. And just to prove to you that it's a genre, there are a bunch, and I've only really included the ones here. The first one is iconic in that it's the first. You can see we've got Gary Oldman playing the rabbi. It's quite a terrible film, but it's got the dybbuk and the exorcism and the Holocaust backstory. It's interesting and worth watching if you like horror movies, but for our purposes, there's no Yiddish, so I'm not going to show you anything from it. But then we've got these other films, and you can see I've indicated with little asterisks which ones have Yiddish dialogue and which ones have Yiddish words or accents. And so that's very, very common. So we've got this Yiddish accented dybbuk world that we've created, and it's been very influential, as you can see from item number 6, which is Dybbuk. You can watch this on Netflix. It's a remake of another film from India that is a dybbuk story with, and it's in Hindi with a little bit of English, a little bit of Hebrew, no Yiddish, but it's the same dybbuk narrative. And what we find starting in number 2 is we start to get tropes, 21st century dybbuk tropes. So the big trope with the possession is this thing called the dybbuk box. No, you've heard of a dybbuk box. Has anyone heard of this or gone to see one? Dybbuk box? Okay, so you're not the average American. A lot of Americans, particularly in places like Vegas, are fascinated by this artifact, which was actually invented. It's more folklore. This was a journalist who created this myth of a box that holds a lock of hair and small things that supposedly was transported from Eastern Europe by a Holocaust survivor and holds the soul of somebody who perished in the Holocaust. It's called a dybbuk box. And that myth came out really in tandem with the release of the possession, I would say as a promotional tool. And it's still an urban legend that continues. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of these dybbuk horror films. This is 2012 Possession. People aren't loving subtitles yet. We're not at a point in 2012 where everybody's living off their phone and closed captioning everything. And so mainstream American viewers were still resistant to the idea of having to read subtitles, particularly for fairly traditional horror genre film. So I just want to show you this clip. This is another way that Yiddish gets used. So Yiddish is used as the voice of a possessed person who's trapped in another person's body in a different time. But there's also a trope where Yiddish is spoken by Hasidim who become the experts. So if you have a possession, you need an exorcism, right? That's required in all films in this genre. So who's going to be able to lead you through this exorcism? Well, you need a Hasidic rabbi. And that trope is found in the 1937 Polish film as well. So here's the way that this film handles Yiddish, which is spoken for a few minutes, but we don't need subtitles. What we've got here is we've got this main character, Clyde, whose daughter has a dybbuk box that she's picked up at a rummage sale. Don't do that. Don't pick up a dybbuk box at a rummage sale. And he's figured out that he needs to go find some Hasidim. And so he drives into Borough Park and he finds some Hasidim and he gets them to explain what this thing is and what to do about it. So you're watching for the way the Yiddish is managed and what it does.
What does this man want with my daughter?
The dybbuk cooked for
Dybbuk looks for innocence, a pure soul. It will move back and forth from the box, searching for a proper host. The host begins to hear voices, experience visions. All of this is the deception of the spirit.
So I'm going to pause there just because it gets a bit scary, and I don't want to show you things that are scary without your consent. If you like scary movies, this one's definitely worth watching. But notice what's happening is we have this sort of almost documentary style voiceover technique where you can hear the Yiddish. It's makes it eerier, right? Because we have these two layers of language happening, like it's a palimpsest, right? It's two layers of language simultaneously. But the function of the Yiddish is not associated with the dybbuk. The Yiddish is associated with what do we need to do to get rid of the dybbuk and to manage this monster, which is not a Yiddish-speaking monster. So this is the same method that gets used for C-3PO in Star Wars, right? There's somebody who's doing the translating for us. And the Yiddish creates this very eerie sense of us being very outside of the culture that has the mystical knowledge to manage this demonic force. This is a very different example. I picked this one because it is very politicized. This is Poland 2015, Marcin Wrona, who's a roughly third generation post-Holocaust, but not Jewish, not from a survivor background, but of that generation of third generation reckoning, where the question about what happened to Poland's Jews. So Poland had 3 million Jews. Where did they go? That narrative was never really addressed post-war Poland in a really detailed way. So there wasn't the same reckoning that happened in Germany, for example. And in 2015, legislation was being passed that it was illegal to suggest that Poland had in any way played a role in the destruction of its Jewry. That was entirely the fault of other parties. So this is Demon, this is Marcin Wrona's way of interrogating that. And what he's doing is he's asking the question, where did the Jews go? So this is a narrative of a man named Piotr, and it's based on a play by the same name that was staged a few years earlier. And Piotr, he goes to Poland to marry his beloved, who's a Polish woman. She's not Jewish. His background is unclear. He might be Jewish. We don't know anything about him. And he goes to visit her family estate, which they will inherit after the wedding, and he accidentally uncovers a corpse. And something happens to him. And he becomes possessed. And as the wedding continues, he's sequestered in this cellar. And there's a priest who's brought to do an exorcism. Nothing works. He's beaten up by his new brothers-in-law who are just frightened of him. And this man here, Shmuel, is the only living Jew in the town. And he's the one who uncovers what is going on. So I'm going to play you this very short clip. It's in Polish and Yiddish. And one of my complaints about this movie and many other films with subtitles is that we are not told what language is being spoken. So I know what's Polish and Yiddish, but part of the effect is lost if the audience isn't told. But other than that, it's a very powerful film. So I'm just going to show you a little piece. So that's the groom, Piotr, who's possessed.
Warum
Okay, so that is just a really short clip, but the Yiddish here functions as a mode of discovery, and it's a signifier where the Yiddish essentially stands in for all of Poland's vanished Jews. They've been buried, they've been submerged. If they could be unearthed and communicated with, maybe some healing could happen. Related or not to the content of this film, Marcin Wrona committed suicide soon after the film was released. Critics did not love the film when it came out, and we don't know his thoughts in depth about the film or Polish politics because he unfortunately didn't live to tell us about that. But his use of Polish was very deliberate. Itai Tiran, who plays Piotr Hanna, had earlier starred in a film called Homeland, which was made in Israel, where he used a lot of Yiddish. The entire 40-minute film is in Yiddish. And so he already had an ear and some knowledge of the language to be able to do this. This is a scary one, which I might leave for the Q&A if anybody wants to ask about it. This is a movie called The Vigil, where there's fake lore of this invented possessing force. This is a very frightening scene. I've shown this, the first time I showed this on Zoom, I actually watched somebody fall off her bed. So you could ask me about it and I will play it for you, which gives people the choice. But for this one, I just want to point out that we have this narrative again of a Hasidic character. So Yiddish is associated with immigrants, shtetl people, possessing victims of the Holocaust, and Hasidic characters who are guides. In this case, we have a Hasidic character who is experiencing trauma that the possessing force feeds upon. So he's somebody who's just left the Hasidic community, he's off the derech, suffering from mental illness and poverty, and the loss of his brother, which this scene shows, and we have this possessing force that capitalizes on that and tries to possess him because of the trauma. And the Yiddish operates in a very particular way to gain his trust and allow that possession to happen. So I'm going to leave that one, but feel free to ask me about it. The question of when Yiddish isn't used is as interesting to me as when it is. So this is a film called Attachment. This is a lesbian comedic horror dybbuk film made in Denmark. Right? It's fascinating. It's a really, really interesting film. The filmmaker, again, the filmmaker's first ever film, he is very multilingual, and to him it made sense to have a film that had multiple languages. So it's in English, it's in Danish, it's got Hebrew in it, and it's got Yiddish in it. And Yiddish is an insider language that's spoken between the main character who has a dybbuk in her, the main character's mother, and her brother-in-law, who is playing that Hasidic mediator who's trying to figure out how to perform an exorcism. I'm just going to show you a little clip of it, because what we've got is the scene where by which time they had run out of money, the film was over budget, and so by the time it got to the end, they couldn't do the Yiddish translation, they couldn't have the multilingualism, because they had run out of money to pay people to do it. So there's this scene where we have a dybbuk who's English speaking, but we hear a little bit of Yiddish spoken by the Hasidic brother-in-law when he's talking to his quorum, his minion of people, because there's this trope that you have a minion, you need to have a black shofar, there are these ritual things that people start to expect, and we see that here. So I'm just going to play you a very short clip of this so you can get a feel for the vibe of this film.
I hope it won't have to come to this.
So this is the possession. The exorcism.
We have to prepare a soul devourer.
So this is invented. It's fake lore. Everybody gets to invent their own exorcism.
It's black magic ritual. We haven't really tried it before, so. Yeah, we'll start by creating this holy ring, and we'll use this bow to seal the ring, thus trapping the soul within the circle. Now Leia is fully under the Dybbuk's control. Yeah.
So that if the Dybbuk is in the circle, well then that's who the devourer will devour. However, the ritual cannot be interrupted once begun. That's what it said. Once my friends begin chanting the Shemot, the names of God, the devourer will come for a soul. If one is not offered in the circle, we'll look for souls elsewhere and...
We all die.
Yes. That's why we'll first try and talk to it. You know, the negotiation with the dybbuk. We hope it won't have to come to this.
So there was a little line of Yiddish there where you hear the sort of murmuring where he says, we're going to get started. That's the only Yiddish they could do. I think it was a financial issue from what I understand from the filmmaker. They wanted there to be a lot more Yiddish in this film, but financially they couldn't do it. But here we have an example of a film that I watched in this last scene before I found out about the financial issues, where I said, why isn't this dybbuk a Yiddish-speaking dybbuk? Why isn't it speaking ancient Akkadian? Why are we getting that multilingualism? But this is a film where we have the Yiddish speaker as a mediator, so that Hasidic character who moves between languages and is there to help us perform this exorcism, which is another trope around Yiddish in dybbuk films. This one here is one of my favorite films ever made. It's called To Dust. I highly recommend it. It's just a beautiful film. And I'm just going to show you a very little piece of it. What we've got here is an exact mirroring of that 1937 film by Waschinsky. The film is actually in this film. And what we have is a story of a widower, Shmuel, who wants to find out how long it will take for his wife's body to decompose, because he has a belief that once her body physically leaves this world, her soul will be able to go to another plane. But he's very uncomfortable with her being trapped on Earth. So he enlists the help of Albert, who's a college science professor, and they conduct an experiment where they get a pig and they bury it, and they assume that the pig will decompose at roughly the same rate as the wife, and when that pig is decomposed, Shmuel's character will be able to know that his wife has gone to a better place. But the dybbuk is at the center of the story, because Shmuel's two sons are convinced that their father has a dybbuk, but they have no idea what that means. There's this urban folklore among these Hasidic children that a dybbuk has entered Shmuel, but they actually have no idea what it means. So these boys go to their school principal and they steal the dybbuk tape, some kind of a VHS cassette that has the answer that will tell them what they have to do to manage the dybbuk. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of this. Here we go. So these are the two boys in the basement of their house. And it's intercut with the two men checking up on this pig.
und Verstorbene Kirchen aus der Welt, wandern die Seiter, greifen sehr euch weiter auf. Und am Umtreff, aber verbunden Telefone, bringt ein nach fremden, lebendigen Gift, wo sie dir am Holen gerät. Du sie war
A cemetery. Do you think that's where Tati goes at night?
Chazan like the chazan. Well, how about that, huh? I see. Act of decay. Yeah! Huh? The chazan like the chazan. What? Haza? What's Haza? It's a pig, Albert. A pig! You might as well just beat it up and set you heaven! I don't think anybody would order that. Smell, buddy.
All right, so I'm going to pause there. I wanted you to hear that there's a bit of comedy. So it's a black comedy that deals with essentially the mourning process. And we can understand the dybbuk here as the unfinished process of mourning. The boys actually conduct a mini exorcism, and their father does improve in terms of how he's managing his grief. And at the end, there's this resolution that happens. But the dybbuk becomes the way that the boys understand their father's grief. They need a way to encapsulate it. They need a signifier. They need something physical that they can do to manage their father's catatonic behavior and inexplicable disappearances. And so the dybbuk becomes the way that they do that. All right, I'm going to show you two more things which are very short. This is a classic mockumentary, Eugene Levy at his best. It's very short, it's like 20 seconds long. This is a tradition of parodying the dybbuk. So the dybbuk became really the most iconic Jewish play of all times. It's been staged hundreds, thousands of times as an opera, as a ballet, every possible way you can imagine. So this is kind of a riff on that parody tradition. This is a mockumentary about this small town that stages a theater production and how they see themselves as actors. And this is Dr. Alan Pearl, who's a dentist, explaining his own theater heritage.
There's a thing that I think I got an entertaining bug from my grandfather, Chaim Kroka, who was very, very big in the Yiddish theater back in New York. He was in the sardonically irreverent Dybbuk Schmibbuk, I said more ham.
Okay, so this is 1996, so we've still got that generation that remembers going to the Yiddish theater, and this is absolutely irreverent humor with a little bit of Yiddish thrown in that as a nod to that Yiddish theater tradition. So there is a humorous thread. This is not a horror thing at all. But I wanted to show you how the humor has evolved parallel in relation to the dybbuk, because nothing is sacred when it comes to these traditions. But that brings us to Difficult People, which is one of my favorite comedy TV shows of all time. It's a Hulu production. It stars Julie Klausner and Billy Eichner as these two quite despicable comedians who move through New York doing despicable things, right? They go into a church and they complain that there's no coffee there and there's a service going on, right? So it's that kind of thing. It's kind of cringy. This is an episode called Code Change, where the storyline is that we have Jackie Hoffman playing this character called Rachel, who's Billy, the main comedian, his sister-in-law. She's very frum. She swears like a sailor. She has very strong views on everything. And her husband has gone off to join the IDF in Israel and to contribute, but he's rejected. And so he's hiding in her basement. But she doesn't know this. He's too ashamed to admit that he was sent home from the airport. And so he's living in the basement eating crackers and waiting for time to pass so that he can stage his heroic return. But she thinks it's a dybbuk. So his brother goes down and finds this out and realizes what his brother's doing, but doesn't want to tell Rachel because he doesn't want to shame his brother. So they devise this plot by which they're going to stage a dybbuk exorcism. And they do research and they create this whole convoluted plot where they place a false ad on JDate for the ideal Jewish woman, which is actually hilariously funny. And then this is the exorcism, right? So it's not entirely in Yiddish, but it has lines of Yiddish, and I want you to see how the Yiddish is functioning. Because it's not treated as a communicative language, it's treated as part of this ritual that she's concocted. So I'm going to play you this. It's a minute, and this is the marvelous Jackie Hoffman, who is a Yiddish speaker, and so is. Okay, so that is the last slide that I have. So what's happening there to me is so interesting because there's an expectation that viewers are going to be familiar with the dybbuk trope, at least in some superficial way. It's 2017. There have been enough dybbuk iterations out there that's an expectation. And notice how Yiddish functions along this uvulating, invented, gibberishy language as part of an exorcism scene. So Yiddish is now being used in order to do the exorcism of the demon. The demon is not expected to be a Yiddish speaker. It is expected to be multilingual. She's trying every language she knows, right? So there are bits and pieces from ancient languages, from Yiddish, from English, the uvulating, which adds that ritual aspect. And then lo and behold, at the end, the dybbuk is gone, right? So from her end, this was a successful process. This was a successful ritual. So interesting for our purposes is the way that Yiddish is embedded in there. If you recognize that it's Yiddish, then you have that information. The average viewer might just hear this as a bunch of unrecognizable, liturgical, gibberishy language. But if you know Yiddish, it adds that extra dimension of humor, because Yiddish is associated with the dybbuk and the dybbuk is associated with Yiddish. So if you're going to do an exorcism, it makes sense that you would have some Yiddish as part of that narrative. So I'm going to end there. That was the journey I wanted to take you on. I'd love to know what you think or answer any questions, or if people want to see the scary scene, I'm happy to show the scary scene. Yeah? Okay. Because I was told I could go a bit over it because I have film clips and it wasn't actually me talking. Okay, let's see. Let me actually open it for you. All right, so I'm going to set this up. Be prepared for a jump scare. So if you have a heart condition, just know that this is coming. All right, so that's, all right. It's less scary if you don't know what's coming. I mean, more scary if you don't know what's coming. These are the key points of interest in this topic. And there's new material coming out constantly. So I'm coordinating a Yiddish horror short of movies that have come out in recent years at the Jewish International Film Festival in Australia, because people are creating these new products where they're working in different ways to generate the Yiddish dialogue and have it do different things in the horror genre. So these are just examples of ones that are dybbuk and possession themed, but there's this whole world of, particularly as filmmaking becomes less expensive and easier to do, and you can essentially make a film with your smartphone. How are people managing the Yiddish, the multilingualism? Why do they want to make films in Yiddish? What are the new tropes being introduced? And interesting for me is what are best practices? So how can people work collaboratively to create high quality Yiddish dialogue for those of us who understand the Yiddish and for whom that matters? I didn't play you examples where the Yiddish is very difficult to understand and basically gibberish. But we've moved into a space now where there are professional Hasidic actors and translators, like Sarah in that last scene. She grew up in the Hasidic world. She actually staged the house so that it would look like a Hasidic house. So there are people who carry this knowledge and expertise who are now being called upon in this consulting fashion and also to act. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see more and more of these kinds of films with interesting new narratives. The end. Did you want me to? Yeah, okay.
Did Isaac Bashevis Singer contribute to any of your research or any of your work at all?
Do you know what? It's surprised me throughout this process how little research that we would expect happens around these productions. People are inventing their own stuff. They really are. They're not reading or they're not drawing on Bashevis Singer. If they're drawing on the Dybbuk film, it's more about aesthetics and thematics than the actual content. It feels more like a springboard than something where there's research happening in those Jewish sources, where naturally you would want to read Isaac Bashevis Singer to learn all about the apotropaic practices around demons and this very deeply embedded Jewish traditional notion that we're surrounded by spirits and demons and we have to appease them. They're around us all the time. It's very deeply embedded, but we don't see that aspect come out in these 21st century productions. The filmmakers are either not aware of this or not interested. It's not the story they want to tell. And again, this is a creative process. There's an aesthetic vision that these filmmakers have. There's a narrative they want to create and establish, and they're not necessarily doing the work we would expect them to be doing. So the answer is, as far as I know, no. But they should, but they don't. Yes?
I think there's an interesting comparison to be made between Yiddish and Latin. Certainly, I think of the movie The Exorcist. But both of these are quasi-liturgical languages. I know that Yiddish isn't really, but it seems that way. They're both dead languages except in wildlife reserves, right? Whether those are churches or monasteries or Orthodox communities. Yiddish has the added advantage of being actually associated with the dybbuk and also being associated with a essentially murdered culture. But I don't think that Yiddish is unique in the ways that you've been describing.
It's not at all unique. What's interesting to me about the Yiddish use is that there are these particular tropes that we can trace that tell us how mediated narratives of the Jewish experience are using new strategies and new techniques. So how are we telling these new, very nuanced stories? And language is becoming increasingly important in that. The use of Latin in the exorcism and French as well, right? So we have this demonic figure who is speaking foreign languages, and we establish their foreignness by the fact that they're speaking Latin and then French in the exorcism. I don't think that's coincidental. That's this trope that we are foreigners. We can't possibly understand this demonic force. We are powerless. It speaks languages that we don't know. But the language that's used in the exorcism is language that anybody who studied first semester Latin or French would know. Like, it's gibberish, but it's very simple and recognizable. And so the viewer knows that it's Latin and French, doesn't necessarily understand what all of it means, but gets very clearly across the message that this is a foreign entity. This is no longer a child, this is a demonic possession. And I think we see a similar thing here, where there's this foreignization that happens by virtue of these possessed characters speaking in Yiddish. And then there's also that additional piece where in the exorcism we have the priest who understands these languages and is able to converse, whereas the family of the possessed child can't. So this mediation trope, where they're speaking the right languages, is very helpful. Having access to that knowledge base, that language-based knowledge, is essential to combat this evil force. So I think those are, they're very deeply established tropes. Not coincidental, I think, that the filmmakers who established these tropes are children of Holocaust survivors who grew up in multilingual homes. So that's, I think, a Jewish contribution. I can't prove it, and I'm not the only one who thinks this. There are scholars who have published on this, reading the entire horror genre as a post-Holocaust response, essentially.
It's completely opposite from Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles. They have a scene where the Indian, played by Mel Brooks, speaks in Yiddish, and my father member leaned over and told me exactly what it was. And I wondered what you thought of that whole sequence and all that particular moment.
So that's so interesting because we're in the early 1970s. And so there's an expectation that if you're going to release films, particularly in major urban centers, that you have enough Jews in the room going to see, if it's Mel Brooks, the Jews are going to go see Mel Brooks, and there'll be enough of them that they're doing this thing called whisper translation, right? If you're sitting in a theater in New York, chances are within 3 seats of you, there's somebody who speaks Yiddish in the early 1970s who's whispering to somebody what is going on in that scene. So translation through subtitles was an absolute taboo in that time. They would not have been able to do it. But for Mel Brooks, the whole thing was a gag because he did this process where he thought, what would be the most ridiculous, absurd thing to do linguistically, but also showing kinship between Jews and other minoritized populations. Where in the 1970s, this was still very much an active question. The whole discourse around Jews as white hadn't really become expressed or thought through. And Jews were still feeling very much as a minoritized population in affiliation with other minoritized populations, particularly indigenous communities, African American communities. So this was Mel Brooks's tongue-in-cheek way of articulating that connection. But I think your experience was, from what I've read, very typical of how people digested that scene. And now if you look at that scene on YouTube, it's subtitled, people are explaining it. It's also become a very problematic scene where people have called for a ban on the film because of its representation of various, if you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. But I think this is kind of a generation removed from that. Because in the 21st century, you can't expect there to be people in a theater who are going to whisper translate Yiddish for you. You have to have a strategy for translating, usually subtitles. And you have to expect that, at least in America, people aren't going to understand what you're saying. In Europe, when these films are shown in Europe, you don't necessarily have to subtitle because there are enough people who study German that they can sort of pick through a lot of the Yiddish, which is often quite Germanized to keep it more simple for the actors to deliver their lines. But I think this is a complete flip of that scene from Mel Brooks. Sarah.
Thank you. This is such an interesting, rich, and nuanced talk. I have so many ideas. I'm wondering about the term pseudo-subtitles. Can you say a little more about that? Like, are you suggesting that it's not translated accurately? And tell us more about that.
So pseudo-subtitles are when you're looking at subtitles and they are actually the original script. So the idea that there was a subtitling process is a fallacy. Normally, subtitles come from something that was created in another language and we need the subtitles to understand. So let's say an Italian film at a film festival being shown in New York, you're going to have subtitles so we can hear the Italian and read the subtitles, but we fully expect that there was Italian originally delivered and there is an Italian speaking audience, but we just don't happen to have that linguistic capacity. The pseudo subtitles, there's no original audience, there's no original body of speakers. The entire thing is an invented fiction because inevitably the Yiddish that we hear is actually translated, and inevitably the subtitles that we read are the original script that the screenwriter or creator wrote and then gets translated. So it's this very strange kind of convoluted process where you get a script in English. Like I looked at the Coen brothers, A Serious Man, and you can see exactly how that translation happened. And I actually was really lucky that the translator shared with me his translation and his process. So he was given this English language script and told, make this sound idiomatic, make it more interesting than what we gave you. And so he embellishes it and he uses these nice, very authentic Yiddishy terms. But the final product is that we are reading the original English script written by the Coen brothers as the subtitles, but in our minds, we're hearing a translation of something that was spoken by people who actually know the language in a context where then an audience would have understood it. We just aren't that lucky. So that's the pseudo-subtitles. It's that essentially creating this fictive world that extends, the box of the fictive world is bigger than typically because there's an invented notion of how language is functioning and who understands and who doesn't.
Yeah, and that's similar to the Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. We just had a performance of that here, and there were surtitles, and it's the same kind of thing. It was a Yiddish translation of the English, which was, related to the Yiddish stories of Shalom Aleichem. But when I saw it as a Yiddish understander, I could get different things from it than other people who didn't. Like I was laughing at certain things or, touched by certain things that the people around me weren't necessarily. And you get that also with other products that are created for a predominantly non-Yiddish speaking audience, but are in Yiddish, like Midlife Crisis, for example, where you get subtitles that are hilarious in relation to what they're saying if you understand Yiddish.
So this is an interesting phenomenon with pseudo-subtitles because you have this relationship between what's spoken on screen and the subtitles from the beginning. You can basically do away with all the rules of subtitling that the industry complains about. So there are rules, like you're supposed to have a certain number of words on screen at a time. You're not supposed to swear in a subtitle. That's completely taboo. So you can have the F word said in another language, but you can't see the F word on the screen. Midlife Crisis immediately starts playing with that. So all the vulgarity, the subtitles in Yid Life Crisis, if you haven't seen it, you can go on YouTube and watch these little sketch videos. They're all in Yiddish with subtitles. But the subtitles are often much more vulgar than the spoken Yiddish, which is part of their humor and part of their shtick, but is a taboo in the subtitling world. Officially, you're not supposed to do that, and they break all the rules in doing that. You had a, yeah.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So I've seen some of these dybbuk films. They're excruciating to watch, really, I think, including the Polish one. And I find, and also having read some of the old Yiddish texts about dybbuks, they are characterized as demons, as you say. They're really negative stuff. So Ansky, in contrast, both the play and then the film made from it, is subversive, because you've got the dybbuk as a lover. It's Leah's lover. It's not someone, who's demonizing her in any way. Obviously, I won't say the end, but yes. So have you thought about that? Can you say something about that? To me, that's a really unique aspect of that film.
No, absolutely. So, and this is something that was happening more broadly in Yiddish popular theater in the 19th century, early 20th century, is these dybbuk narratives where it's a love story, which is a new phenomenon. Audiences liked this. They enjoyed it. And so it was done once in a shun play, sort of lowbrow play, successfully, and then it became something that was done more widely. And Ansky was no doubt influenced by that trend, that people enjoyed seeing this kind of melodrama. The question of how you would depict an actual dybbuk on screen is a really interesting one, because there are so many collected narratives. And there's an entire corpus of work that looks at dybbuks from the vantage point of psychology, because in the documented cases in the early 20th century, most people who had a dybbuk possess them, most of those people were teenage girls who suddenly mysteriously began to speak in a male voice and demanded freedom and let me out of the house, I want to go and study like everyone else, right? It's kind of like a demonic Yentl narrative. But this happens over and over again. And so people have done analysis and said, well, the dybbuk was really a socially acceptable way for young girls to gain a sense of independence within a society that didn't give them a lot of freedoms. So there's that reading. That would be an interesting thing to do on screen, I think, the narrative like that. But from what we know about this traditional Yiddish-speaking community in Eastern Europe and then migrating, they really believe that we are surrounded, like Isaac Bashevis Singer's world, that we are surrounded by these supernatural forces. So if you know anything about Yiddish tradition and people, saying poo 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 or kinahare, kineinahare, right? If you say something positive, you immediately have to invoke some supernatural force, because words are magic. Words have power. I just went to a 3-day conference on Kol Nidre, and one of the things we talked about is that Kol Nidre is actually a conversation about annulling vows. So this is the start of Yom Kippur, the big iconic prayer, and it's actually about annulling vows. And the vows that you're annulling are vows that invoke demons, right? So part of what you're doing is protecting yourself against false vows that you can't keep, but it's also a nod to vows that you may have inadvertently made with the demonic realm. And oh no, we don't want that. And this is part of a really long tradition of having this very clear sense, like a lot of traditional societies, of having a connection. So we're between two worlds. There's the supernatural world and our world, and they are connected. And the dybbuk really allows us to tell those kinds of stories. I would love to make a dybbuk film with all of the bells and whistles. So I'm in Los Angeles. Anybody want to make a dybbuk film? Give me a shout. I think it would be fascinating. Yes, please.
I have a question and an observation about what your thoughts on. First is, your point you made early in your talking was the idea that Yiddish is somehow inherently funny. And I'm wondering where you think that idea came from and when you think it evolved.
So that's a book that I'm writing. So it's big. It's a big question. And there is a lot of disagreement about, or not disagreement, but different ideas about where that idea came from. A lot of it has to do with the very prominent place of Jews in the entertainment industry, but not as overtly Jewish, so as veiled. So what you do if you're doing mainstream television, you throw in a little Yiddish wink to your Yiddish people, you're Jews, here I am, I can't, because this is early network television, I can't be openly Jewish. Even Seinfeld was problematic in 1989, where the television network essentially said, no one wants to watch a story about nothing that has Jews. Nobody wants that, which is why George Costanza's character is Italian. They didn't think that was something America would go for. So there's this subtext of nods and winks that happens in Yiddish. There are also very important performers who come from a Yiddish background, who start in Yiddish vaudeville, and then they take those skills into the mainstream. There are theories that are wrong, I'm going to say it, that Yiddish sounds funny. Yiddish does not sound funny. There's nothing funny sounding about Yiddish, but that has also become a trope. There's a thing in Yiddish called the shma reduplication, like money shmoney, which is a way of sort of, doing this. And that feeds into that self-deprecating humor that's very much broadcast in America as part of what Jewish humor is. There's also Mad Magazine. If you're a reader of Mad Magazine, you cannot overstate the impact of Mad Magazine and all the Yiddishy stuff that's in there, because all of the creators of Mad Magazine were Jews. Right? But they were Jews who couldn't broadcast their Jewishness. Mad Magazine was not a Jewish publication, but there's so much Yiddishy sounding stuff in there. And so you're basically training generations of infantile teenagers, like I was when I read Mad Magazine, that these Yiddishy sounds are funny. Right? Saturday Night Live coffee talk. Right? So verklempt. So these words start to have a resonance and be labeled as funny. And we, as audiences, are trained, I think. This is just a trope that we accept, and so it gets perpetuated. And from what I've read about what happens in television writers' rooms, people will often, 4 a.m, you've been writing this episode, okay, we need a joke here. What's a good joke? Okay, well, let's throw in a Yiddish word. Yeah, easy, right? I can do that. Because so much of what happens in the writers' room for sitcoms, for comedy television, happens in that very sort of manic environment. And Yiddish it's been a go-to for really a century, in a sense. But I'm working on it. So if you have ideas, I'm also interested in hearing them. But I think it is a trope that has evolved in all of these various ways.
Thank you. Just one other quick thing. I noticed in the moment that you described as pivotal in the 937 Dybbuks, when Leah starts to transform in front of her eyes, she begins to sing. I'm a musicologist, so I'm always attuned to unintended musical moments like that. And I noticed that not only did her voice kind of become sing-songy, but it became a little more melodic as she went along. She sort of gained confidence, I guess, in her connection to the nether world. And that the melody had this very distinctive augmented second, so characters of Jewish music. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether musical moments appear in any awful ways in the film, or if they thoughts you had about that.
So generally speaking, everything I've read about this scene agrees that that musical augmentation really makes that scene iconic. She improvised that. Yeah, that's from what I've read, and it's almost a century later, but from what I understand, that was just something that she did. The music kind of came to her, and it wasn't written into the script. The words were written into the script, but she kind of gave it that Jewish Ashkenazi trope in not in the way I've been using it, but trope in how you read, liturgic, what you do when you're praying or reading from sacred text, and you attribute it a melody. So that's what I understand, that's how that happened.
Just a very quick comment, and that's really fascinating. I'm so glad you shared that. In the early 20th century musical theater, the augmented second is so often used, composers often use it in that it precisely for moments of intense dramatic or emotional impact. So I wonder if
Yeah, it's fascinating to know that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we do one more. Okay, one more. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you just say a bit more about kind of the traumatic death and grief related to the role of the dybbuk? Is that across the board, or was that only in some of the films more recently? How much is trauma part of the point of the dybbuk?
I think this is a new trope. But that having been said, if we accept that there were all of these cases of a dybbuk possession that were documented by rabbis, by psychiatrists, we have a lot of data on people who claim to be possessed by dybbuks, and how much of that was trauma and grief, and what we would call mental illness, schizophrenia. And the dybbuk was a way to articulate a state of being in two places at once, right? So not being comfortable in your body or wanting to be someone else, right? We have all kinds of terms for this now, but in 19th, 18th, 17th century Jewish traditional culture, you wouldn't have had terminology for this. Someone would have looked at you and said, "Was ist a dybbukerein?" Like, have you become possessed by a dybbuk? That line, right? Because what other language do we have to express somebody who's experiencing gender dysphoria or schizophrenia or a feisty desire to go out and experience the world in a way that isn't appropriate to the gender that you're assigned, right? So I'm sure there's a fascinating layer of analysis that could happen there, but I do think that use of the dybbuk as a way to signify those experiences has a connection with the traditional figure of the dybbuk, how people understood it. Thanks.